Good afternoon. My name is Kim Ponzio, and I'd like to welcome you to the Society of Wetland Scientists September webinar. And today we're going to be hearing about the scientist's second warning to humanity in a wetland context and the development of a Declaration of the Rights of Wetlands. I want to offer a special welcome to any non-member guests we have joining us today for our quarterly free webinar. All of our webinars are complimentary to SWS members, but once a quarter, we open it up to the public. Our next free quarterly webinar will be held in December 2019, which is what we call our legacy webinar, with this year's Lifetime Achievement awardee, Mick Davidson, presenting. Before we get started with the presentation, I'd like to give our guests a little overview of what SWS is all about. So as you see on this slide, our mission is to promote the understanding, conservation, protection, restoration, science-based management, and sustainability of wetlands. Since its founding in 1980, the International Society of Wetland Scientists has continued to grow with greater than 3,000 members from more than 60 countries around the world. We have a diverse membership hailing from all sectors of wetland science, from academia, practitioners, consultants, government employees, NGOs, and also a large sector of students. We're committed to providing our members meaningful resources that promote wetland education, conservation, and restoration globally. SWS membership includes full access to the Wetlands Journal, Wetland Science and Practice, and other professional journals such as Wetlands Ecology and Management. In addition, SWS members enjoy discounted rates for the SWS Professional Certification Program, access to regional chapter and section activities, student programs and grants, and discounted registration at the SWS annual meetings, all of which provides members the opportunity to just network with wetland professionals from around the world. So I would love it if you would visit our website at sws.org to learn more about becoming a member if you're not one, and all of the membership benefits. And today I'm proud to announce that this webinar has been pre-approved by the SWS Professional Certification Program, and that means it's applicable for continuing education credits. And you can get participation certificates through an automated process. What you'll have happen is an email from our SWS Managing Director, Michelle Chosek, will arrive about one day after the webinar. And go ahead, if you don't see it, to check your spam email for that. Their certificates are free to SWS members and are available for non-members for a nominal cost of $20. Participation certificates are also available if you view our webinar recordings. And those can be found on our past webinars page, as you see on the screen, and also on our YouTube channel, which is complete with multilingual captions. Again, my name is Kim Ponzio, and I'm a past president of SWS and the current chair of the SWS Webinar Committee. And I'll be your moderator today. So before we get started, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items. The general format for today's webinar will be about a 45-minute presentation by our speaker, followed by approximately 15 minutes of questions. So that anytime during the presentation you think of a question that you want to ask our speaker, you can go ahead and type it in the questions pane. And then I will read those questions to the presenter at the end of our presentation. The webinar is being recorded, and you'll receive a link to that recording following the webinar. And we also ask that you take a moment to fill out the evaluation survey that you'll get. That helps us plan for future events. And if you'd like a copy of today's slides, you can go to the handouts pane and click on the PDF, and you can go ahead and follow along with that. And if you're tech savvy, you can tweet about today's webinar at #SWSwebinar. So with the logistics out of the way, let's go ahead and get started with our webinar. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, my colleague and very close friend, Jillian Davies. Jillian has been working as a senior ecological scientist at BSC Group since 2003, where her work focuses on the intersection of climate change and wetlands. Prior to that, she was an education and outreach specialist for the Division of Wetlands and Waterways at the Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection. She served as the 2016-2017 president of the Society of Wetland Scientists. Prior to this, as president of the New England chapter of SWS, she chaired the program committee for the 2015 annual meeting in Providence, Rhode Island, where the theme was Changing Climate, Changing Wetlands. Since that meeting, she's been collaborating with other wetland scientists and a climate scientist as part of the informal SWS Climate Initiative, including a presentation similar to this at the Ramsar Section Symposium at the 2019 meeting in Baltimore. Jillian was a contributing author to the Massachusetts Climate Change Adaptation Report in 2011 and has spoken on wetlands and climate change in Massachusetts, Connecticut, Maine, and New Hampshire, and then further afield in Puerto Rico, Portugal, Taiwan, and China. Jillian has a Master of Environmental Studies degree with a concentration in ecosystem ecology from the Yale School of Environmental Studies and a bachelor's degree from Williams College. She's a professional wetland scientist, a registered soil scientist, and has additional certifications with 28 years of experience working in the field of wetlands. So with that introduction, I'd like to hand control over to Jillian and we'll get started.
Thank you, Kim. And I just want to make sure I think I've got all the controls here. So today I'm going to talk about the World Scientist's Second Warning to Humanity and the emerging rights of nature movement and how they relate to wetlands and how a group of SWS wetland and climate scientists are responding, including developing a declaration on the rights of wetlands. Before I get started, I'd like to thank all the indigenous peoples of the world who've been teaching the rest of us about another way of relating to the natural world, one based on gratitude, reciprocity, relationship, responsibility, and an acknowledgement of the animacy of nature. We have a lot to learn from cultures that understand how to live in balance with nature. Okay, looks like I can advance the slides. Before I get to the second warning, I'd like to introduce the first warning from World Scientists, which was issued in 1992, over 25 years ago. In 1992, 1,575 of the world's most prominent scientists, including 99 of the then living 196 Nobel laureates, signed the World Scientist Warning to Humanity and sent it to governmental leaders around the world. The lead author and coordinator was Dr. Henry Kendall, chair of the Union of Concerned Scientists and the 1990 Nobel laureate in physics. The language is strong and is not typical objective language of scientists. In that warning, the scientists said that they warn all humanity of what lies ahead. The first warning identified major environmental threats to the planet, including environmental degradation, overpopulation, overconsumption, and climate change. The warning identified several significant actions needing to be undertaken simultaneously in order for humanity and the planet to change course, as noted on this slide, and including restoring ecosystems, halting ecological degradation, and stabilizing population. It identified that the developed nations are the largest polluters and must reduce overconsumption and provide aid and support to developing nations. It stated that this is enlightened self-interest, not altruism, and that not following this path risks increased conflicts, mass migrations, and damaged global biological systems, which affect all. Developing nations must recognize the seriousness of the threat of environmental degradation and must address overpopulation. And success will require a great reduction in violence and war. The first warning issued a call for all to join in this task for a new ethic and identified important groups of people who must participate in order to achieve the goals. So if we scroll forward a few years to the present, and as you may know, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, has recently issued a new report. The IPCC report warns us that we need to make substantial and rapid changes in our carbon emission patterns within the next 11 years by 2030, and that the effects of climate change will likely persist for centuries to millennia. Additionally, land use change and other significant environmental impacts proceed apace. 25 years after the first warning, things weren't looking much better. In fact, they were looking worse. So in 2017, another group of scientists issued a second warning, the World Scientist Warning to Humanity, a Second Notice, which was published in Bioscience. Prior to the publication deadline, over 15,000 scientists signed the second warning article, and since then, over 5,000 more have signed. The lead author, William J. Ripple, is at Oregon State University, noting that, quote, humanity has failed to make sufficient progress in generally solving the foreseen environmental challenges, and alarmingly, most of them are getting far worse, end quote. The second warning has led to many continuing actions. New to the second warning is a timeline. Soon it will be too late to shift away from our failing trajectory. Similar to the first warning, the second warning identifies the problems, proposes actions, and calls for all of humanity and particular groups to engage in this effort. In acknowledging climate change, the authors identify not just fossil fuel emissions, but also deforestation and agriculture, particularly farming of ruminants for meat consumption, as being major contributors to the problem of anthropogenic climate change. The second warning proposes several actions to change course, including prioritizing conservation, halting land conversion of significant ecosystems, stabilizing population, promoting green technologies, and outdoor education. The second warning calls for all people to respond at two levels, both by individual actions and by collectively applying political pressure. Again, this is a new sense of urgency. We don't have forever to make these changes if we want to avoid catastrophic climate change and widespread human misery, as well as biodiversity loss and ecological collapse. Time is of the essence. Do you ever feel like we're hanging by a thread? So what's the solution to all of this? Well, sometimes a short-term solution seems like the right choice. It can be overwhelming, and a short-term chocolate break sometimes can be very beneficial. But we can do more. Seriously, there are solutions and the warnings are being heard. A number of actions have resulted from the two warnings. The first warning inspired the second, and the second's gathering strength. An outgrowth of the second warning is the formation of the Alliance of World Scientists, the only independent grassroots organization comprised of scientists from around the world committed to the well-being of humanity and the planet. AWS is, quote, independent of both governmental and non-governmental organizations and corporations. AWS has noted the special role that scientists play and our unique responsibilities. A documentary has now been made about the second warning. Non-scientists are invited to endorse the second scientist warning and to sign a petition to save global biodiversity. And scientists are invited to sign on to an article titled "The World Scientist Warning of a Climate Emergency," which is being submitted to a peer-reviewed journal. And in response to the second warning, Max Finlayson, president of SWS, had the idea of writing two wetland-specific articles, one in Wetland Science and Practice and one in the Wetlands Journal. We shared the journal article with the authors of the second warning, who loved it, and put out a request to other scientists to develop other discipline-specific second warning papers. These papers, including the Wetlands paper, which is titled "The Second Warning to Humanity, Providing a Context for Wetland Management and Policy," are now available on the AWS website. Our second warning in wetlands article shares the clarion call of the second warning with the wetland scientist community and offers ideas for how we as wetland scientists can respond to the call. The article translates the second warning into wetlands relevant actions and recommends strategies and actions such as avoiding amplification of carbon dioxide and methane releases from wetlands, protecting wetlands from climate impacts, and incorporating knowledge and input from local and indigenous communities into responses and solutions. The article suggests that the second warning presents an opportunity for the wetland scientist community. SWS and similar societies and Ramsar can recommit themselves to combating the loss and degradation of wetlands and loss of associated ecosystem services, including those related to climate. The article requests that wetland scientists engage national leaders who often do not understand the importance of wetlands, and draws attention to the inability of national governments to deliver required results as signatories to the Ramsar Convention, and the necessity to reappraise implementation of the convention, and then references the Sustainable Development Goals. The second warning and wetlands articles are actually an outgrowth of a multi-year effort now being called the SWS Climate Initiative to draw attention to the significance of the contribution that wetlands make to the global carbon cycle, to climate change adaptation and resiliency, and to the threats that wetlands face in a changing climate. This group has been collaborating with Bill Muma, a climate scientist from Tufts University's Global Development and Environment Institute, initially having come together as organizers and speakers at the 2015 SWS annual meeting in Providence. In collaborating with wetland scientists, Bill contextualizes our wetlands work into the broader climate change discussion, with the result that we've written 2 peer-reviewed papers and have been presenting symposia. Our first paper is Wetlands in a Changing Climate, Science, Policy, and Management, which is a comprehensive review paper on wetlands and climate change. The second paper is our second warning paper. These collaborations are the direct results of efforts by the Society to bring together scientists from around the world to address science, policy, and management pertaining to wetlands in a changing climate. And the initiative continues to develop. A further outgrowth of the initiative has been the publication and republication of an article written for the general public and based on our Wetlands in a Changing Climate article and published on the Conversation online blog. The article has garnered over 66,000 downloads and was selected by the Conversation as one of 5 essential reads on wetlands for the 2019 World Wetlands Day. The Ramsar Convention, the first modern treaty between nations aimed at conserving natural resources, has the stated goal to, quote, halt worldwide loss of wetlands and to conserve through wise use and management those that remain. The World Wetlands Day theme for 2019 was wetlands and climate change. At the October 2018 Ramsar COP13 in Dubai, SWS hosted an event on climate change and wetlands. The SWS and Ramsar partnership has been supporting goals identified in the second warning for many years and presents an ongoing opportunity for wetland scientists to make a positive impact. What do things look like moving forward in response to the 2 warnings? Are we doing enough? How do the successes measure up compared to the losses and degradation? Specific actions for wetland scientists and SWS could include continuing to bring wetlands to the attention of the IPCC, the Convention on Biological Diversity, and climate scientists and policymakers at all levels of government, supporting the Ramsar Convention on Wetlands to approve their 5 draft resolutions on climate change, supporting the development of wetlands protection and conservation laws, regulations, and policies in countries and states that don't have them, and including recognition of climate-related ecosystem services, preventing and undermining of existing wetlands protection laws and regulations, such as the current U.S. administration's efforts to replace and repeal the 2015 Clean Water Rule, which would exclude over 50% of currently protected wetlands in the U.S. from federal protection. Developing best management practices that incorporate the state of the science with regard to carbon biogeochemistry and ecosystem gas exchanges, continuing to engage in the scientific enterprise, and being the voice of science and evidence-based decision-making to the broader world. All of these are important and will make a difference, but perhaps we also need to shift paradigms and take another approach as well, given the dire situation that the planet is in. Why might a paradigm shift be needed? Because efforts thus far to conserve, protect, and restore wetlands while slowing the loss and degradation of wetlands have not prevented them from continuing to be lost and degraded globally at alarming rates, nor prevented biodiversity and ecosystem losses and climate destabilization. What can be done when current efforts are not enough? A paradigm shift that looks to the examples of indigenous cultures around the world and the growing rights of nature movement could bring about the sea change that the natural resources and land management approach has failed to accomplish. What indigenous cultures would like us to understand and what the rights of nature movement advocates for is a shift in values and in how we think about our relationship to the natural world that also then translates into changes in law. Our language reflects our values and our culture, thus both reflecting and defining our relationships. And it is notable that many indigenous languages grant animacy and the status of subject rather than object to the natural world, whereas non-indigenous languages often relegate nature to the world of inanimate objects to be owned, managed, and at times exploited. An example, as provided by Robin Wall Kimmerer in her book, Braiding Sweetgrass, Potawatomi language grants animacy to nature, including whole ecosystems, thus acknowledging a reciprocal relationship and rights. In contrast, English only grants animacy to humans and thus distances us from other forms of life and distances us from moral and legal obligation to other organisms and ecosystems. Where we might say to someone who's stressed out, go for a walk in the woods, Potawatomi elders would advise, go among the standing people, which implies a fundamentally different relationship, one among equals, one where the walker has something to learn from the standing people, and where an active relationship with mutual giving and taking is implied, on a par with human-to-human relationships. Deriving in part from the wisdom of indigenous peoples and in part from a Western history of advocating for the rights of nature, such as the voices of Henry David Thoreau, John Muir, Christopher Stone, Roderick Nash, and Thomas Berry, the emerging rights of nature movement reflects values long held by humans of many cultures around the world. In 2001, Thomas Berry authored a declaration of the rights of nature titled The Origin, Differentiation, and Role of Rights, in which he addresses the innate rights of both humans and nature, recognizing the subjectivity of all components of the universe rather than reserving subjectivity strictly to one species. He outlines 3 basic rights that all living and non-living components of the Earth community have: the right to be, the right to habitat or a place to be, and the right to fulfill its role in the ever-renewing processes of the Earth community. A particularly significant accomplishment occurred with the passing of the Te Awa Tapua Bill, or the Wanganui River Claims Settlement Bill, in March of 2017, where the New Zealand Parliament granted the Wanganui River, including wetlands, the legal rights of personhood, and legally recognized the special relationship between the Maori iwi, iwi meaning tribes, and the river. As a legal person, the river has the same rights and responsibilities as a human person, similar to how New Zealand law recognizes the personhood, rights, and responsibilities of companies, trusts, and societies. The Wanganui iwi have been advocating for legal recognition of the river's rights and their relationship to it since the 1870s. It's believed that the Wanganui River is the first river in the world to be granted the rights of personhood. Although just 5 days later, the Indian Uttarakhand High Court granted the rights of personhood to the river Ganges. In 2014, the New Zealand Parliament granted personhood legal status to the Te Arawera, a forest with wetlands that previously had been a national park in a settlement with the Tuho iwi. And in the past several years, numerous other ecosystems have been granted the rights of personhood. I started with the New Zealand examples because the Maori iwi have been working for over a century to achieve legal recognition of their relationship with the living entity, their ancestor, the river, and the rights of the river as a living being, and because the river and forest include wetlands. The earliest recent non-Indigenous example of nature obtaining legal rights occurred in 2006 when the Tamaqua Borough in Pennsylvania, USA, working with the Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund, codified the rights of nature by protecting both the environment and the people from the effects of dumping toxic sludge into empty coal pits and on farmland where it was being given out as free fertilizer. Rivers from the Tamaqua feed into the Schuylkill River, a water supply for the city of Philadelphia. And in 2008, the Ecuadorian government rewrote their constitution to include the rights of nature. One of the constitutional provisions granting rights to nature shown on the slide, Article 71 says, nature, or Pachamama, where life is reproduced and occurs, has the right to integral respect for its existence and for the maintenance and regeneration of its life cycles, structures, functions, and evolutionary processes. In terms of wetlands, in addition to the various specific rivers and lakes, inclusive of their wetlands that have been granted rights, there now exists a Universal Declaration of River Rights developed by the Earth Law Center. Other examples of recent rights granted to ecosystems by legislatures and courts include Lake Erie in Pennsylvania, USA, the Atrato River in Colombia, the Vilcabamba River in Ecuador, the Yamuna River in India, and Mount Taranaki in New Zealand. Inherently, the rights of wetlands are embedded in the rights of rivers, forests, and other ecosystems, for without wetlands, the broader ecosystems cannot thrive. This slide outlines some of the main provisions of the Universal Declaration of River Rights, such as the right to flow, the right to perform essential functions within its ecosystem, to be free from pollution, to feed and be fed by sustainable aquifers, and the right to native biodiversity, and the right to regeneration and restoration. Although the rights of wetlands located within river systems, forests, or other ecosystems are indirectly granted rights when the broader ecosystem is granted rights, as far as I know, no declaration on the rights of wetlands exists. And since not all wetland types or wetland characteristics are acknowledged in existing rights of nature documents, a group of SWS wetland scientists is coming together with the support of the SWS Ramsar section to develop a declaration on the rights of wetlands and a justification for such a declaration. Interestingly, the wetlands community excuse me, has been moving in this direction, albeit without realizing it over the past few years. At meetings and conferences, wetland scientists around the world have been drafting, signing, and supporting declarations, statements, and proclamations about the importance of wetlands and their conservation, protection, restoration, wise use, and contributions to protection of a stable climate, biodiversity, and ecosystem services. However, these aspirational affirmations on the importance of wetlands have not yet called for the recognition of the rights of wetlands. It would seem that a declaration on the rights of wetlands is the next logical step. So what might we want to include in a declaration on the rights of wetlands? The right to exist seems pretty good as a place to start. The right to an ecologically determined location on the landscape. the right to a natural, connected, and sustainable hydrologic regime, the right to ecologically sustainable climatic conditions, the right to indigenous biodiversity, the right to regeneration and restoration, the right to its own structure, function, evolutionary processes, and ability to fulfill natural ecological roles in the Earth's processes, and the right to be free from pollution. So what is the point of these declarations, statements, and proclamations? Will they do any good? Let's take a quick look at some examples from history to see if it's possible for outside-the-box declarations to change perceptions of rights and to shift paradigms. In 1215, excuse me, King John of England signed the Magna Carta, often viewed as the first document to establish personal rights and the foundation for British and British-based law. It became a symbol of freedom and the rights of people and is considered to have influenced the writing of the US Constitution. Also issued at the same time, well, in 2017, was the lesser-known Charter of the Forest, which reestablished the right of free men to access the royal forest. The term forest at that time included wetlands, grasslands, and heaths, as well as forests. Quite possibly, the Charter of the Forest is one of the earliest instances of people creating a document with negotiated rights to access ecosystem services and nature. In the 1700s, a few upstarts in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania declared independence and declared that all have a right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These were not commonly accepted ideas at the time, but they are now because of this document. In wildness is the preservation of the world. These famous words of Henry David Thoreau, a proclamation from the 19th century, helped inspire the wilderness conservation movement and the eventual passing of the Wilderness Act in 1964. Thoreau was a philosopher, holistic thinker, conservationist, and also an ecologist before the term existed, who recorded detailed observations of the natural world. By fusing science and poetry, Thoreau reached a far broader audience, both geographically and through time, than most scientists reach when we stick to our data and facts. This is an example of the importance of the science communication, and art spectrum in communicating the value of science and ecosystems to the broader public and to policymakers. Following World War II, the UN drafted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which provides a roadmap for guaranteeing the rights of all individuals everywhere in the world. It carries the force of law, but is not a binding treaty. The intent was to change societies following World War II excuse me, in the hopes of preventing future atrocities and guaranteeing fundamental human rights. It continues to serve as a living legal document. The photo shows Eleanor Roosevelt, U.S. delegate to the UN General Assembly and leader of the drafting committee for the declaration and chair of the Human Rights Commission, displaying the French version of the text. Eleanor Roosevelt stated that this declaration may well become the international Magna Carta for all men everywhere. And perhaps these statements are effective on the personal level, helping to create a personal commitment and a personal ethic, or as a teaching tool to spread an ethic at the individual or community level, thereby changing values through cultural change. We may be surprised by the idea of a declaration on the rights of wetlands, But is it really any more radical than the Magna Carta, the Charter of the Forest, the Declaration of Independence, or the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in their times? The success of the Rights of Nature movement and a Declaration on the Rights of Wetlands, as well as the Changshu Declaration, the Baltimore Proclamation, the San Juan Statement, and Denver Declaration, depends on all of us. I would encourage all of you to use these aspirational affirmations. I'm sorry, I'm just recently getting over the flu, so I apologize for my throat. I would encourage all of you to use these aspirational affirmations and declarations to spread the word, build consensus, and influence policymaking to establish a new ethic and a new legal framework that recognizes the subjectivity and rights of wetlands and other ecosystems, thereby averting the further loss and degradation of wetlands and catastrophic destabilization of our climate. The rights of nature is a paradigm-shifting response to the scientists' first and second warnings, and a declaration on the rights of wetlands might just lead to achieving actual sustainability and wise use, whereas our efforts up until now have merely slowed the loss and degradation of wetlands. Finally, I would posit that when we establish aspirational and visionary proclamations, declarations, and statements, we can't know their ultimate impact, but we can be sure that these statements have power. They act as a North Star for our behavior, whether at the individual, community, subnational, national, or international level. They have the ability to transform our scientific knowledge, our data, our information, our rationality into something more, something with a touch of Thoreauvian poetry, a vision for a better future that, if successful, can literally transform our world and our society by changing norms and values. Where will this lead? We don't know, but neither did the signers of the Magna Carta, the American Declaration of Independence, nor the parties to the Universal Bill of Human Rights know where those documents would lead. Perhaps the next step for wetland scientists in responding to the second warning is to advocate for Ramsar and signatory countries, as well as subnational governments, to establish universal rights of wetlands. Thank you. And now I'll hand it back over to Kim.
So I'm going to be reading the questions that I got from the participants that I received through the question pane. And if you forgot to ask a question, you could do it now, or if you have to leave before the Q&A is over, you can email Jillian at the email address you see on the screen. And let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to ask you a really quick question that I got is, what species of frog, and I assume that the plant he's talking about is on the bone set. They recently saw one in their office, so that was probably not one you expected to get. But I had just commented on that picture, Julian.
Well, I think it's a green tree frog.
Yeah, okay. All right, that was an easy one. All right. So let me ask you something that's a little more in depth here. So in the context of the rights of nature, how do human rights get taken into account?
That's a really good question, and I think one that occurs to a lot of people. Well, humans are part of nature, so this does not mean that the rights of nature would somehow supersede human rights, but more that there's that we live in relationship with nature, and that there needs to be more consideration and thought for the natural components of the system and not just ourselves, and there needs to be a balance and a way of using the gifts of nature that's not exploitative. So it's not that the example of indigenous communities is a really good one. It's not that indigenous people don't use natural resources. It's just that they traditionally in their traditional societies knew how to use those resources without overtaxing them or exploiting them. So it means finding that balance.
So one of the things that I noticed was in the second warning, you talked about this, was conversion of areas, not only for our fossil fuel consumption that we're worried about, but also conversion of areas, and in the news recently, Brazilian rainforest to raise cattle. So I was wondering, we talk about a lot of times the balance between worries about economic advancement for the cultures that are in possession of those, I guess, those habitats and those ecosystems. So can you talk about how that balance, how you envision that balance happening, and if these, what we're proposing here, the rights of nature and the rights of wetlands, how that might impact anything that we go forward in trying to stop the degradation of those areas?
Yes, well, I guess the first thing is I'm not an expert on the Amazon or the people who live there, so I'm hesitant to speak too specifically about that, but I do know that the indigenous people in the Amazon feel very threatened by the recent burning of the Amazon rainforest, and it seems to be driven by, the more corporate interests, and so using resources in balance would mean that the system is not completely wiped out or completely clear cut or burnt, but that there is some harvesting or some wise use that supports the people without that kind of wholesale, burning of 20% of the Amazon that's being reported in the news.
Well, and I thought too that it's interesting to think about the fact that those in the developed countries who have already impacted a lot of their ecosystems already like this, and exploited those ecosystems, not always, in not everything, but they've already exploited them. How can we help them? Because it's easy for us to say you should conserve and you should protect those ecosystems because that's how they are right now, but they are in a different developmental phase of the country. And so, I mean, I know that Holland pays Brazil and another country, I can't remember where, I'm sorry, not Holland, Norway, pays Brazil and another country to preserve areas and conserve areas so that they do have a means of a livelihood with the preservation of those areas. I don't know what you think about that kind of broader scope, because you talked about how a call to action. Is there something there that we can really make an impact on other people other than just us in our community?
Yeah, I think. Yeah, and I think that the developed world does have that obligation to support the developing world to protect the natural resources in the developing world, and I think that model is a good one, because we all depend on the ecosystem services and the healthy functioning of a lot of the natural systems that exist all over the world in developing and developed countries, both of them. So it's recognizing our common dependence on global ecosystems, and it does take some support from the wealthier part of the world for the less wealthy part of the world.
All right, thank you. I'm going to ask you a question here I have here. Obviously starts out, well, we could write this declaration on the rights of wetlands, but how do we sell this to non-wetland people or non-scientists or people that currently undervalue wetlands? How do we influence others through this?
Well, I think that comes to the importance of scientists becoming sort of bilingual communicators. We are trained professionally to communicate with other scientists in scientific articles and scientific language, and I think for us it challenges us to go outside of our normal writing style and write and develop publications. And it cannot just be the written articles, but maybe it's in video format, social media, other formats where we change our writing style to be something that is more consumable by an average citizen. And that's what we tried to do with our comprehensive wetlands in a changing climate review paper, where we worked with the editors at the blog, at the Conversation blog, and they're really skilled at doing this. They regularly work with peer-reviewed article authors to convert the ideas in those papers into about 1,000-word articles for the general public, written at about a 9th grade level, like a common newspaper article, so that the general public can understand the ideas and importance of what we all know and understand. And then I think social media and the visual world is a really great vehicle also for communicating to the broader world about the importance of wetlands. And I actually think a declaration on the rights of wetlands will help with this, because it is, first of all, it's kind of an exciting new idea when people first hear it, but it also relates to something that the general public is familiar with, which is the rights of this or that, the Universal Bill of Human Rights, the Declaration of Independence, Magna Carta. So that's the importance of that historical context. Is this isn't completely out of the blue. It's another way of thinking about rights, and we've done it before. We've as a species, we've created human rights. If you go back far enough in history, basic human rights were not legally guaranteed at all. It was just sort of might makes right. So I think
a lot of people probably don't realize that you know, the history. So I really appreciate you kind of giving the history on that, because I think we don't really appreciate that nowadays, right? In some of the countries that we're probably all, you know, calling from developed countries. So I think that is something that we fail to appreciate more recently. Yeah. And so one of the things, though, I wonder, like, what is the next step, Jillian? What do we do next? I mean, I love the Alliance of World Scientists. I'm not sure we need to go back to the page because people have the PDF, but I think if you're interested in trying to, you know, mobilize an effort here, going to that, it's scientistwarning.forestry.oregonstate.edu. Going there is one place. And also, I was wondering, do we have that conversation article from the Conversation blog? Is that posted to the SWS website?
I don't know. It would be great if it could be posted to the website. Depends on SWS policy about posting specific articles, though, and I'm not sure what that is at the moment. So if people are interested in that, you can Google the Conversation and what the world needs now. More swamps was the actual title for the Conversation blog. And yes, for a further action, I think visiting the Alliance of World Scientists website, and if you haven't already signed on to the second warning and to their the new paper on climate emergency. That those are great things to do, and the group of scientists involved with the SWS Climate Initiative is in the process of drafting the declaration on wetlands, and we anticipate publishing. We're going to submit it for publication in a peer-reviewed journal, and so at a certain point, we'll probably model it off of the Alliance of World Scientists model and ask people to sign on in support of it. So those are some things, and then once that's published, then anybody should be able to take it and share it with people and promote it. And already there are a number of aspirational statements that people can use, and they're the aspirational statements like the Changshu Declaration on Wetlands that was signed at the Intikal conference in 2016 in Changshu, China, and then at the last 3 SWS annual meetings, there have been some statements and proclamations. They're kept fairly brief so that they can convey ideas and values and some specific actionable items, but they can be shared with people, with policymakers, and just to help point people in the right direction. And I think just trying to get out there in people's communities, communicating with decision makers about all the importance of these things. And then I think the other thing is to participate in comment periods when there are proposed rule changes. Here in the US, we're unfortunately facing a situation where the current federal government's administration is trying to undo decades of wetlands and waterways protection by repealing the 2015 Clean Water Rule and other aspects of the Federal Clean Water Act, such as the water quality provisions in Section 401. There's a currently an open comment period for the 401 proposed rule changes. So I think being active in those discussions is another thing people can do right now.
I have, it's somewhat unrelated. I didn't actually realize it until this morning. You may or may not have heard of Greta Thunberg, I guess, from Sweden.
Yes, of course.
Well, and tomorrow apparently is the climate strike on Friday, September 20th. She's actually going to be in New York City. So
yep.
If that's something that people want to get involved in, check it out, look that up. But I mean, those are things where we're talking about the changing climate, how that's going to impact wetlands, and that's one of the things that you listed on the rights of wetlands. And so I think that's it's very good timing too for all of this. So that's something else that people could support. I think at this time I don't have any more questions. Do you have anything else that you want to leave as last parting words, or something that came to your mind while you were answering questions?
Yeah, I think that if people are interested in this subject, I would recommend reading some books or articles by people from the indigenous communities, because this is a perspective that's been around for a very long time, and for various cultural reasons, a lot of us have not fully been aware of what their culture has to bring to the table, and is really, really valuable and could be very important and helpful for the whole world now, as we're really trying to turn the ecological crisis and the climate crisis around.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Jillian, for taking time out of your busy schedule, and also for presenting after you just had the flu. I'm glad we made it through, and you did a great job. So thanks for sharing your expertise on that intersection of climate change and wetlands, and also delivering really something thought-provoking about what can we do now, what are our next steps. So it'll be interesting to see how things progress on that Declaration on the Rights of Wetlands. Before we sign off, I do have a couple of announcements on upcoming SWS events. Let's see if I can go to the next slide. I can. Okay. Our next Spanish webinar is going to be next week on September 25th, and it'll be presented by Alejandro Flores Lozano. And he's going to be talking about the ecologic and economic assessment of the Villa Maria wetland in Peru. And as a reminder, all of our Spanish webinars are offered free to both members and non-members alike. And this will be a live broadcast of a recorded webinar. Also, be sure to follow or subscribe SWS social media channels like Facebook and LinkedIn to keep informed and to support the Society. And we also have a YouTube channel where all of our webinars are posted 3 months after their original broadcast. So you can go there and see all of our webinars. I believe we have 40 different webinars up there. And if you're Spanish speaking, be certain to subscribe to the Latin America and Caribbean region's Facebook page at the link listed here. And soon, right now they're doing Spanish webinars, but we hope that we'll be offering their own webinar series via Facebook Live. So go ahead and subscribe to that. And then finally, please mark your calendars for our next SWS webinar, which will be held on October 17th. And that will be presented by Ahmad Madavi, who will be talking about toxic pollution in wetlands and remediation actions. So again, I want to thank Jillian for her presentation, and thank you to our audience for participating today. Have a wonderful day. Bye, Jillian.
Bye-bye. Thank